Tēnā koe e te mana whakawātuaro, tēnā koutou katoa e ngā mema o te whare. Mr Chair, in this committee stage debate on the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill, I just want to start by saying that Part 1, in particular Clause 3 of Part 1, is a very, very sensible clause, sir. This updates the framework that the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board will operate in to make it far more relevant to the 21st century environment. Clause 3, under the interpretation, it actually clarifies the meaning and the difference between the new board and the old board. This is important because there have been changes in the real world that actually make meaningless some of the previous legislation. For instance, the Associated Churches of Christ no longer exist, and this is laid out very clearly. The old board, the Associated Churches of Christ Church, no longer exists. That institution, Mr Chair, changed its name some time ago. They are now the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board, and they will be regularised. As my colleague Brett Hudson referred to, bringing the arrangements for governing the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust under the Charitable Trusts Act 1957, like the vast majority of other church-held property would be registered under. And in fact, the vast majority of charitable trusts, full stop, are regularised under that general law rather than requiring their own particular individual legislation. That does, to some extent, future-proof the organisation against the changes that they will face in the coming years. Sir, the very practical example of how this will play out is given by my colleague, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith, when he spoke about this bill in the introduction to the House. In his own area in Nelson, he is now the proud owner, I suppose, the landlord of property which was once part of the Church of Christ Property Trust. The Annesbrook Church, which now forms his electorate office, and in fact was outgrown by its congregation. So that was a positive sign for the Church of Christ. They actually managed to outgrow the buildings in which they were based, allowing it to be disposed of to Dr Nick Smith so that he could put his home and his electorate office into that property. They moved to a new complex in Saxton Road. So this particular clause of the legislation, sir, does clarify that every type of property, real estate in particular, which is held by the churches, is able to be transferred, to be disposed of. Their existing powers remain, but there is another important word here that I want to refer to. In Clause 4, under the purpose, it also talks about the obligations. My colleagues have focused primarily on the property rights and interests of the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board, but actually there are obligations. So where debts, for instance, may be owing on properties, where there are other conditions that need to be abided by the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board, those obligations will continue to remain. So by defining that very clearly, this is page 2, sir, of the bill, by defining that very clearly and outlining that those obligations of the old board are transferred to the new board, we don't end up with, sir, the problematic situation where the assets are moved across but the liabilities are kept with the old board once it is dissolved. The powers of the board, this is also important, sir. The board must be able to conduct its business. It must remain the master of its own destiny. So retaining the existing powers, not adding any additional powers and not removing powers, but retaining the existing powers of the board, along with the obligations, along with the interests in the property, whilst you do transfer to the new board, I think is particularly important. And just on a technical level, that land will be registered in the name of the new board under the Land Transfer Act 1952. So effectively the name on the title will transfer across. That, sir, is 3B 3 of this particular part of the legislation. Very well drafted, it's very clear, short and crisp, but excellent.